through other eyes. A Story of the Black Ship Universe. Chapter 1. Arrival. The deck vibrated again. Not the sharp, violent shudder of weapons fire, Kael knew that feeling too well, but the long, low hum that came with another jump spool winding down. It rolled through the Exalted Virtue like a tired breath, metal bones settling after being dragged across another stretch of void faster than anything had a right to move. Kael Rynn didn't look up from the half-disassembled raptor in front of him. 10 years out of Royal Academy, Kael had been diligent, working competently and quietly to reach Senior Petty Officer and earning his assignment to the Fighter Division on the Exalted Virtue. At almost 2 meters tall, Kael towered over most of his commoner compatriots, and his naturally gray eyes could be mistaken for low-grade cybernetics from a distance. This had worked out in his favor a few times in the past when, during leave, he had received better treatment in port due to being mistaken for a noble. It was not a ruse he intentionally used, but who was he to dissuade it in those rare instances it occurred? Being called Lord was thrilling, even if the pretense was dangerous. With a rueful chuckle, the 27-year-old pilot thought how he had become acclimated to danger over the last few weeks. Running a gauntlet through his short-cropped, chestnut-colored hair, he checked his datapad, focusing on the last coupling on the reactor coolant line with deliberate care, fingers steady even if the rest of him wasn't. The flight tech had sworn that it was repaired and secured, but then that tech wasn't depending on it out in the void. The smell of burnt metal and recycled air clung to the hangar. It had been there since Ravensol, and it wasn't going anywhere. "Jump complete!" the announcement called across the hangar. No urgency, no relief, just confirmation. Another system, another nowhere. Kael exhaled slowly and leaned back on his heels, eyes drifting not to the fighter, not to the crew moving around him, but past it, through it, to something that wasn't there anymore. The Battle of Ravensol still burned in his mind. Even now, almost 4 weeks and 24 blind jumps away from Astoria, he could still picture it. The void lit with particle beams and railguns as defense grids collapsed and the orbital batteries were torn apart as capital ships exchanged barrages so close to the exosphere the clouds beneath it boiled. The kind of battle that didn't end clean and left pieces of itself in you. They hadn't won, but they hadn't lost either. They had escaped. Retreat was the word command used. It sounded clean, strategic, and intentional. It wasn't. It had been a break. A fracture. The ships loyal to the prince tearing loose from Astoria's gravity well, while half the Ravensol system tried to hold them there. Some in loyalty, others in betrayal. The home system of House Astor, the seat of power of the Astorian Principality, had fallen to Duke Cornelius Draymore. Kael's jaw tightened as he thought of the self-appointed Lord Regent. Draymore, supposed protector of the Principality. Traitor, if you asked anyone still serving loyally under the Raven's banner. Savior, if you believed the traitor fleet's communications during the battle over Astoria. It didn't matter what you called him. He had the fleets, enough of them anyway, and they were hunting. Kael pushed himself to his feet, rolling his shoulders as a dull ache crawled up his spine. Over 4 weeks of constant jumps, combat readiness cycles, and unrestful sleep in a hot swap bunk in the commoner pilot berth would do that. His body felt like it had forgotten what stillness was. Around him, the hangar moved the same way it always did. Efficient, controlled, disciplined, but somehow slower. Subtle if you didn't know what to look for. A deckhand missed a step on a ladder and caught himself half a second too late. Someone dropped a tool, cursed under their breath, then went right back to work like it hadn't happened. The Void Flight Director of Third Watch, or Deck Boss, Petty Officer Mara Cade, wearing her yellow and black checkered void armor, was barking not-so-quiet corrections at a pair of crewmen who should have known better than to leave a fuel boom unsecured. No one stopped. No one complained. They just dragged themselves forward because there wasn't anywhere else to go. Kael glanced up at the line of raptors secured along the deck, sleek, predatory shapes dulled by scorch marks and quick repairs. All of them had been in the void in Ravensol. Only half of them had returned to the Exalted Virtue. All of them were still void-worthy. But they shouldn't have been. Not like this, without proper refit, not without rest. But every time they dropped out of FTL, there was the same quiet expectation. Be ready. Because one of these times, the Draymore forces chasing them would be waiting. Rynn. Kael turned his head slightly. Warrant Officer Jace Rook stood a few meters off, arms folded, expression as unreadable as ever. At 32, Rook was the old man among the commoner pilots. The older pilot hadn't bothered to connect his datapad to the repair station. Instead, he just leaned against a bulkhead like the ship itself was holding him up as he watched the technicians work. Having discovered he was balding, Rook had taken to shaving his head, though the dark black stubble still showed the receding hairline on his scalp. His deep brown eyes appeared almost black, and right now they were focused on Kael. "Is the lieutenant's Raptor ready?" Rook asked. "New squadron is going to need all of these in the best condition we can keep them in." Kael nodded once. "It'll fly." Senior Petty Officer Kael Rynn and Warrant Officer Jace Rook were the only two commoners in New Squadron. As squadrons go, Kael had been assigned to worse. Their squadron commander didn't treat them poorly, and other than the unwritten rule of glory kills, the commander wasn't insufferable like some nobles. Rook's gaze flicked over the Raptor, taking in the patched plating, the fresh armor plates from the fabricators, and the slightly mismatched panel near the port coil gun barrel. He gave a faint, humorless grunt. "They all fly," he said. "Question is, for how long?" Kael didn't answer. There wasn't one worth giving as another tremor passed through the deck when the jump drives powered down fully. Somewhere deeper in the ship, systems were recalibrating, plotting, preparing for the next leap. Always the next jump, until they reached safe territory. Kael stowed his datapad and finally let himself look around properly. Faces he knew, faces he didn't. All of them carrying the same thing now, fatigue stretched thin and held together by discipline and habit. No one talked about Astoria or the fall of Ravensol anymore. It was there, in the way people moved, in the silence between orders, in the way every set of eyes flicked toward the void whenever the hangar doors cycled, though it was barely visible behind the kinetic field shielding that kept the hangar pressurized. Had the bright shimmer not been present, everything unsecured would be sucked into the void. Everyone in the fleet was waiting for the next contact, for Draymore's fleets to finally catch up. Kael leaned against the side of the Raptor just for a moment, wishing he could feel the cool metal through his flight armor. His eyes drifted shut, not fully, just enough to steal a second of nothing. It didn't work, and all he saw was the battle. A voice crackled over the internal comms, sharp enough to cut through the fog settling over the deck. "All hangar personnel stand by. New arrivals inbound." "Repeat. New arrivals inbound to the Virtue. Prepare for reception." Kael opened his eyes, and beside him Rook didn't move, but something in his posture altered, subtle and immediate. New arrivals. Out here in the middle of nowhere, with Draymore's forces tearing through the Principality hunting loyalists, and there were new arrivals? Thought Kael. Maybe someone else from the 10th escaped. That thought hurt. When the mutiny began, most of the 10th Fleet had turned traitor. Only about a third of the fleet remained loyal to the Prince, and too many of those ships had been lost, providing the opportunity for the Prince's escape jump. Kael pushed off the hull of the fighter, fatigue shoved aside by instinct. "Could be reinforcements. Looks like we're not done yet," he muttered as he disconnected his helmet from its magnetic lock at his waist. "We are never done," Rook said quietly as gaze stayed fixed on the far end of the hangar where the bay doors were beginning to open. As both men donned and sealed their flight helmets, as did every man and woman in the hangar, the deck lights brightened, casting long shadows across the Raptors as the heavy cruiser prepared to receive whatever had managed to find them in the dark. Kael felt it then. Not fear, not yet. Just a tightening, a tingle up his spine. Something was changing. He didn't know it, but this was the last moment things would make sense. And then the great interior armored doors began to open, heavy plates sliding apart with a deep mechanical groan, letting cold void light spill across the deck. The shift in brightness cut through the artificial glow of the bay, turning every scuff, every seam, every tired face just a little sharper behind their clear helmet faceplates. Kael stood with the rest of the crew along the demarcation line around the rows of Raptors, posture straight out of habit more than energy. Around him the deck had tightened, cleaner, quieter, even exhausted. Everyone knew how to stand when something important arrived. And this was important. The Royal Yacht slipped into view. The Royal Favor's white hull was adorned with purple and gold old trim. Untouched by the wear that clung to everything else out in the void, it moved like it didn't belong to the same reality, the same fleet. Kael's eyes followed it in, expression flat. Astoria fell, and this thing still gleamed. The yacht settled into position with barely a whisper as the docking clamps locked with a muted thud that echoed across the bay. Joining the Royal Favor was a small beat-up hauler. Kael's mouth opened in surprise. What in Julius's name was that thing doing with the Royal Favor? There were no cargo containers, just the hauler itself looking like a stain against the beauty of the yacht. The hauler landed close to where Kael and Rook were standing, and once secured to the deck, it powered down. The pilot exited the craft, and Kael saw a man of average height in average flight armor, well, lesser than average. He stepped off the small ladder to the cockpit and paused just long enough to take in the hangar before turning to face the yacht. No one spoke as the yacht's boarding ramp extended. Nobles first, as they always were. They descended in controlled formation, measured steps, perfect posture. The mixed uniforms of the Royal Navy and the Marines were immaculate or repaired well enough to pretend. Even after Ravensol and a month of running, they carried themselves like nothing had truly touched them. Behind them came command officers, real ones, staff aides and command escorts, the kind who could step onto this ship and start issuing orders that reshaped commoner lives without ever needing to raise their voice. All of it was expected and routine, until the last group began to disembark. Pilots. Kael shifted slightly, more out of instinct than interest. That made sense. Escort survivors, probably picked up out of life pods. There were only 12 or 13 of them, and they came down in ones and twos, some with flight armor that was worn and patched, yet functional. Those with void armor too damaged would have it replaced by logistics and their fabricators. Those who had armor that was not pristine but not broken either would be pushed further down the replacement request list. Almost all of the pilots had the appearance that said they'd seen the escape from Ravensol up close. Again, the hauler pilot caught Kael's attention, not because he stood out, but because he didn't. As the hangar doors resealed and everyone in the hangar removed their helmets, most affixing them back to the maglock on their waists, Kael Rynn got his first look at the pilot of the hauler. The man had his name stamped on the right side of his chest plate instead of his house sigil. He was obviously Navy, but not from the 10th. Each of the 10 fleets had their own peculiarities, so being ordered to wear your name instead of your house crest might be a normal occurrence in whatever fleet the man had served with. The brown-haired man looked controlled, aware, and tired like the rest of them. Kael's gaze drifted, then settled again, as something about him stuck when the man fell into line with the other pilots from the royal favor, not trying to draw attention, not trying to hide either. Just present, Kael's eyes flicked to the rank tabs. Too far to see them clearly, Kael thought ensign? From a lesser house, maybe, based on his flight armor. Possibly an exile. Maybe a bastard. Why a hauler? What military purpose could that piece of junk have? Bastards and exiles were nothing new. There were plenty of them on the ship across all the divisions. Some were experienced pilots, seasoned enough to be trusted, not important enough to matter beyond their role and the skill to ensure their squadron leader got glory kills. Kael's gaze moved on and stopped again as the pilot moved to meet the tall commander in noble armor that cost more than Kael would make over his entire naval career. The name that was stamped cleanly across the pilot's chest plate is what caught his attention, as Kael could read it from where he stood. Staples. As the man turned and surveyed the Exalted Virtue's hangar deck a final time, Kael was finally able to make out the telltale single white bars on his suit collar. They were the same marks that Jace wore. Warrant officer. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. A name that was short, simple, and functional. A warrant officer. Wearing below-average flight armor. He was a commoner. Kael didn't react. Didn't move. Didn't let anything show, but the thought lingered. Not because of the name itself, but because of where the man that owned it was standing, having accompanied the Royal Yacht into the hangar. In a hauler. Beside him, Rook hadn't moved, but Kael could feel his focus, subtle as a pressure change. The older warrant officer's attention had narrowed, locked onto the same point. Not the nobles, but the commoner pilot. Kael kept his eyes forward, but his attention didn't leave the brown-haired man standing next to the commander. The rest of the disembarkation continued. Noble officers were received. Command officers peeled off toward command. Orders would follow soon enough. They always did. The disembarked pilots remained where they were directed, waiting. Staples now stood among them, still, composed, like he knew exactly how to exist without drawing notice. That, more than anything, felt off. Most of the arriving pilots looked around, took in the ship, checked their surroundings. The hauler pilot didn't. He already looked settled, like wherever he'd just come from, this was better. The tall commander said something to the hauler pilot named Staples, and they walked towards the lifts. Unusual, but not unique. Kael exhaled slowly, and around him the hangar resumed motion, quiet, efficient, controlled. Beside him, Rook finally spoke, voice low, almost lost under the hum of the bay. "Watch that one." "Why?" Kael said without turning his head. After a moment, Rook answered, "Because he escorted that yacht in a beat-up hauler." He paused and looked at Kael. Ravensol has fallen. Astoria is captured, and the royal favor picks up a commoner pilot in a hauler as escort. Not one escort ship, not even a single frigate. A hauler. Make that make sense. Kael thought once more about the brown-haired man. Staples. A commoner in a simple hauler escorting a royal yacht after Ravensol. That didn't happen without a reason. Kael adjusted the arm resting on the helmet mag-locked to his waist, as jaw tightening just a fraction. Yeah, he said quietly, watching the lift doors close on the tall commander and Staples. Just as Petty Officer Kael Rynn and Warrant Officer Jace Rook were about to relax, the pounding sound of boots came. Heavy, measured, and in perfect unison. The personnel in the hangar turned again, this time not subtly as necks craned and movement slowed. Even the deck crew hesitated just for a moment, their green and black checked suits all turning towards the sound. Kael and Jace turned with the rest. 2 columns of Royal Marines emerged from the yacht, marching down the ramp in flawless formation. Their armor was unmarred, their weapons held at perfect discipline, each step landing with deliberate weight that echoed across the hangar deck. Someone important was coming. Kael felt it before he saw her. At the center of the formation, partially obscured by the Marines, 2 figures moved forward. The first was impossible to miss. Tall, commanding, blue hair pulled tight and clad in deep red armor that looked less like armor and more like a weapon. The kind of armor that didn't just deflect fire, it invited it. The second, Kael's breath caught. Blonde hair, violet fabric flowing in controlled, weightless motion. Not armor, not protection. Authority, royal, a princess. He didn't know which one, and it didn't matter. Instinct took over. Kael bowed. Deep, immediate, and in absolute subservience. Around him, the entire hangar followed suit, commoner and noble alike, bending at the waist in perfect, silent acknowledgement. No command was given as none was needed. The procession moved past them without pause. The Marines never broke formation, never acknowledged the bow, their focus locked forward as they escorted the princess across the deck. Within moments, the formation reached the cargo lift. The Marines flowed inside as a unit, forming a living wall around the princess as the doors closed with a final, heavy seal. And just like that, she was gone. The hangar slowly rose back to motion. People straightened. Work resumed. Voices returned, low and controlled as if nothing had happened. Kael and Rook straightened at the same time, exchanging a brief glance. Nothing spoken as nothing needed to be said. Then Kael turned back to his Raptor, hands already moving back to his datapad, checking seals, verifying systems. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But something had changed. First, the strange pilot, now a princess. Kael didn't know how or why, but the feeling from earlier returned. That tightening, that quiet warning crawling up his spine. Things were changing, and this time, unlike the panic in Astoria, he felt a flicker of something. Kael pushed the feeling down and continued to check the fighters of New Squadron as Jace Rook returned to lean against the bulkhead and watched. The story didn't arrive all at once, but then it never did. The scuttlebutt started as fragments, half-heard words drifting down through decks and corridors carried by runners, whispered between shifts, traded in low voices where officers couldn't hear. By the time it reached the hangar, it already didn't match itself. Kael was halfway through his final systems check of the squadron commander's Raptor when Tam's Vex slid in beside the fighter like he belonged there. The ordnance runner was a short, slight man who always appeared rumpled, his sandy blonde hair mussed, and the ever-present look of opportunistic greed on his face. "You're in the wrong section," Kael said flatly, not looking up from his task. "I'm in the interesting section," Tams replied, too quick, too eager. "You're going to want to hear this." Kael leaned down at his datapad and pretended to focus on the schematic for a missile rail seal. He didn't respond, which didn't stop Tams from sharing his gossip. "They took him to the bridge," Tams said, an eager look on his face. That made Kael pause, just for a second. "Who, crewman Vex?" "The pilot!" "The one that came in with the yacht." "Staples." The ordnance man blinked like the answer was obvious. Keel's hand stilled. Behind him, metal shifted softly. Rook, somewhere just out of view, not interrupting, had become interested. "Why?" Kael asked. Tams grinned. "That's the part. No one knows. But Jaren, second watch comms, he's on bridge rotation. Said the whole command staff was there." "That's not how that works," Kael said as he leaned back slightly, finally turning his head just enough to look at the little crewman who was the embodiment of avarice. "Yeah," Tam said, nodding fast. "That's what I said." The next version came 10 minutes later with a different voice telling roughly the same story, only this time with added details. After completing the return-to-duty checklist on the Raptors, Kael jogged over to the deck boss office to put in an ordnance order for the squadron. It was easier to hot-void the fighters if they didn't have to wait for the deck apes to arm them. Warrant Officer Rook followed at his usual, less-than-enthusiastic pace. As hangar deck boss, Logistics Petty Officer Mayra Cade controlled the who, where, and what of the launch deck of the Exalted Virtue, at least on third watch. To see her, you wouldn't associate the slender, short-haired woman standing no more than 5 feet tall with the authority a Void Flight Director held. Even the noble pilots did their best not to irritate the duty deck boss, commoner or not. Doing so could deprioritize them in the load and fuel lists, and a later launch meant less opportunity for personal accolades and glory. Strangely, even the logistics officer of the ship, a Lieutenant Commodore, appeared to have a healthy respect for his deck chiefs. Kael leaned on the hatchway, arms crossed, his short chestnut hair still mussed from earlier. His eyes narrowed as he asked, "Say again?" "He stood in front of the prince." Mayra Cade didn't look up from her console when she said it, but her tone had changed, tighter than her usual deadpan voice. "Who told you that?" "Bridge runner," she said. "Direct rotation." That carried more weight than Tam's vex, and Kael straightened slowly. "And?" Mayra hesitated. "They said the prince addressed him directly," as she handed him a data pad. Kael took the pad, reading the message, and that landed heavier than it should have, and the senior petty officer felt something tighten in his chest. "By name?" he asked. She nodded once. "Warrant Officer Wyatt Staples." Rook shifted behind him, which was enough to pull Keel's attention back from his contemplations, and the 3 commoners were all lost in their own thoughts for a moment. Exiting the deck boss office, Kael and Jace heard the hatch slide shut behind them. Warrant Officer Jace Rook began to walk into the hangar, and Kael thought he was headed back to their squadron fighter row. He wasn't. He went further, towards the Royal Favor, but turning to the left after the row of Omicron Squadron Raptors to walk past the 4 Aquilon bombers and across the hangar towards where the hauler landed and was secured with docking clamps. As the tall, chestnut-haired senior petty officer caught up, both men walked around the hauler. The hauler had the markings of the Royal Navy, 3rd Fleet, 2nd Frontier Corps. Well, that explains his name on his chest, thought Kael. The 3rd Fleet is where naval careers went to die. Just patrol frigates and corvettes, not even one capital ship of the line. The 2nd Frontier Corps must be the lowest of the low, he thought with a smirk. That explains the below-average flight armor. Taking a step back and running his eyes over the cargo hauler, Kael Rynn had to pause and think for a moment. Had he ever seen a Navy hauler? He knew of the large naval shuttles and the resupply freighters that the Navy used for fleet and installation supply, but he couldn't think of an instance where he had seen a cargo hauler. He supposed the Navy must have them, though he doubted a pilot over the rank of Navy pilot would be assigned to one. Not unless they were being punished. Severely punished, he thought, as he continued to study the ungainly little vessel with its somewhat beaten exterior and single, pathetic-looking point defense cannon. Calling the hauler ugly wasn't unkind, because it was ugly. Short, blocky, and well-used, the hauler was the form-follows-function utilitarian that only the Royal Navy could devise. Where most civilian freighters and haulers were boxy, the Navy version was downright blunt. Depending on the house, the upper range of civilian freighters and haulers had more pleasant aesthetic, though not the beauty of major or great house designs. In Kael Rynn's opinion, even those paled in comparison to the beauty of Royal Navy capital ships. And then you had vessels like the Royal Favor. Completing their circuit around Staples' hauler, the yacht was framed behind it, and Kael found the little hauler a stark contrast to the almost breathtaking royal vessel with its white and gold with purple accents. "This," motioned Jace Rook, his arm sweeping out towards the unsightly ship. "The pilot of this was called before the prince." His voice incredulous, he continued. "What did Chief Cade say? Warrant Officer Wyatt Staples? A warrant officer flying this hunk of junk?" The younger man cast another gaze at the vessel, then at his squadron mate, taking a breath to answer what was surely a rhetorical question, when the older man sighed loudly in disgust, lowered his shaved head. "Watch will be over in just over 2 hours. We've completed the readiness prep. Send a message to Lieutenant Ignala that we're done, and let's go eat." "Done," said Kael as he sent the message, and both pilots made their way back towards the lifts bay, stopping briefly to have a last word with the technicians working on their fighters. By the time the third version of the Staples story arrived, the hangar had gone quieter. Not silent, but close enough. As Kael and Jace made their way to the lifts to head back to the commoner pilot berths to change out of their armor, they overheard one of the auxilia corporals talking in a low voice to a small group of deck techs and other hangar auxilia guards. "He saved them." Corporal Bren Talon said it like he didn't believe it, as if saying it out loud might make it less true. Kael turned slightly. "Saved who?" Bren Talon was young for an auxilia corporal. Kael would have put him at about 19, though he had a scar on his neck that boldly said veteran, while just under 1.5 meters. What Bren lacked in height he made up for with width, as his wide, broad shoulders and thick frame gave him the look of a mantis tank. His hazel eyes turned to the senior petty officer, and his face took on a sardonic look as he gave a short, humorless laugh. "The royal favor. That's what they're saying, upper deck. Something attacked it. Corvette, black hull, no markings. Staples blew it apart with a cargo hauler." "That's not—" Kael started. "That's what they said," Bren cut in, sharper now. "Through a cargo container, timed the blast, crippled it. Traitor Marines would have been picking through yacht debris if he hadn't—" Kael didn't speak because that sounded real. It was too specific not to be. It reminded him of his fellow pilots boasting in the commoner pilot berths. Those stories usually began with, "You aren't going to believe this shit, but—" followed by a fantastical story that had just enough real to be true, if somewhat embellished. Well, most likely really embellished, but that's what made them good stories. When they reached the berth, both pilots removed and cleaned their flight armor, stowing it, grabbing their toiletries, and heading to the showers. The showers were crowded, as the men and women of the commoner berthing section were rotating shifts, with third watch Kael and Jace's duty watch ending their shift while first watch were preparing for their own. As they showered, Kael turned to Jace and said, "I'll catch you up. I need to soak for a minute after all that crawling during the Raptor checks." Jace Rook just nodded and finished his shower before departing to dress and head to the mess hall with a quick, "Don't waste your entire water ration," tossed back over his shoulder. Kael Rynn bowed his head and let the hot water cascade over him as his thoughts turned over the events of the watch. The morning squadron briefing, where he had been assigned the task of verifying the combat readiness of the squadron's Raptors, then the inspections themselves, before his mind turned to the arrival of the Royal Favor and the strange hauler that had arrived with it, of the pilot that had been flying the hauler, a commoner escorting the Royal Yacht. He registered the sounds of the communal shower dying down and looked up to find it almost deserted as his stomach growled. He hurried to dress and headed to the mess hall. The fourth version of the Staples story didn't come from a person. It came from silence in the commoner's mess. The kind of silence that spreads when too many people are thinking the same thing and none of them want to be the first to say it. Kael could feel that now, all around him. The crewmen slowed without stopping at the food line as the auxilia guards watched without turning their heads. Commoners, his people, eating but not focused. Naval ratings of every division eating. Every one of them is waiting for the last piece of the tale, the true piece. Jake and Kael sat at their usual mess table as Petty Officer Mara Cade approached carrying her ration tray, and Kael motioned her to sit at an open space on the bench. Neither she, Kael, or Jace Rook spoke as they ate, though the warrant officer's face had a darker than usual look. As a warrant officer, Rook could eat in the officer's mess, though he never had, not since Kael had been assigned to the heavy cruiser and new squadron. "Warrant officer, what gives?" Kael Rynn asked. While their relationship could be strained at times, both men knew and depended on the other for their lives. The chestnut-haired senior petty officer did know how to press Rook's buttons, but this wasn't an attempt to do so. He had seen this type of look on Jace Rook's face only a few times in the past, and each of those was when a noble had done something incredibly stupid that had either almost killed or had killed one of their commoner pilot brothers and sisters. Jace Rook's face took on the color of thunderclouds just before the tornado touches down. His response to Kael's questions was low, measured, and certain. "They promoted him." Everything stopped. Not visibly, not enough for an officer to call it out. Not that you'd find a noble officer in the commoner's mess, but Kael felt it, like the air had shifted. Around them, their fellow commoners paused. Those further away appeared to lean towards the table without actually leaning. Those in the serving line shuffled more slowly, footsteps becoming muffled. "Promoted? What? Who?" Mara sputtered around a mouthful of what could loosely be defined as food. Warrant Officer Jace Rook appeared to be searching for life's meaning in his own rations tray. Even with his head down, Kael could see the, not exactly anger, but something akin to it on his squadron mate's face. "Bridge! That wasn't an answer!" Mayra's voice tightened. Eyes narrowed and a fork pointed for emphasis. "That's not a rank. Lieutenant." Rook's jaw flexed once as he spat out the word. The word sat there. In and of itself, it was just a word. Used in conjunction with promotion and commoner, it was just wrong. And lieutenant remained there, heavy, unmoving, and heard by every ear in the mess. The auxilia corporal from the hangar deck was passing by with his own ration tray and stopped as if he had been slapped. Bren Talon let out a short, disbelieving breath and stammered aloud. "That's not... he can't..." "No!" Mayra said, sharper than usual. "He can't..." Bren's free hand curled slightly at his side. "But he did. He is an officer," came the whispered voice of the warrant officer, still doing his best to examine his meal rations at the atomic level. Before Kael could stop himself, he said, "But Jace, you are an officer." The look of abject indignation he received caused Keel's breath to catch. He had never seen his squadron mate this angry. No, this wasn't anger. It was fury. "I am a warrant officer." "A commoner!" Jace Rook hissed at him. As the auxilia corporal joined the table, Kael Rynn didn't speak. He couldn't, because his mind was already moving ahead past the rumor and disbelief to the part that mattered. If it was true, then the system hadn't bent, it had broken. "Who confirmed it?" Kael finally asked, and no one answered immediately, though almost 200 ears surrounding the table strained for a final answer. "Bridge runners," Rook said. "And the third watch bridge auxilia rotation, going off duty, which was enough. I heard them talking on the lift after I showered for mess. Too many sources with too consistent a story." Kael looked back toward the far end of the mess, toward the lifts. The lifts where Staples had disappeared not long ago from the hangar deck. His thoughts played the same words over and over. Warrant Officer Wyatt Staples. A commoner pilot, now a lieutenant. Beside him, Rook spoke again, his voice quiet as if he was talking to himself instead of his squadron mate. "They don't do that. Nobles don't do that." Kael nodded once, almost absently, his voice somewhat distant as he said, "No." But his eyes didn't leave the lift doors. "They don't." Around them, eating resumed because it had to, but it wasn't the same anymore. Where the mess was normally more boisterous now, it was subdued, with the quiet murmuring of men and women that are in shock. Because now, or very close to now, every commoner on the Exalted Virtue knew or would know something that commoners weren't supposed to know. A commoner became an officer. What else could a commoner do? And that was worse for morale than anything Draymore's fleets could do to them.